Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Have you ever scrolled through the news, seen a headline about some massive court ruling and thought, wait, does this actually affect me? Well, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the United States court system to build a mental map of the law. We're going to figure out exactly how legal hierarchy and the weight of authority actually function day to day. So let's just jump right in with the big question. In the insanely complex web of American law, whose rules actually matter? When two courts completely disagree, or when a brand new legal issue pops up out of nowhere, how does a judge know which precedent to follow? It's really not just about who has the biggest gavel or the fanciest courtroom. It is a highly structured system of rules, boundaries, and strict hierarchies. To untangle all of this, we've got a quick roadmap. We're going to hit primary versus secondary law, look at the parallel court systems, define federal versus state jurisdiction, climb the court hierarchy, break down binding versus persuasive authority, and finally, run through some real-world legal scenarios. Let's do this. All right, part one, primary versus secondary law. Before we map the courts, we literally have to ask, where do all these rules actually come from in the first place? Before we even talk about courts, we need to know what constitutes actual law. It basically boils down to a pretty stark contrast. Primary law, that's the real deal. It imposes actual hard and fast rights and duties on you, coming directly from constitutions, statutes, and case law. On the flip side is secondary law, stuff like legal treatises or Black's Law Dictionary. Now, secondary law holds absolutely zero mandatory authority. It literally can't force anyone to do anything. But they are incredibly valuable because they synthesize and explain those primary laws, which often influences judges when the actual rules are super vague. Moving on to part two. The parallel court systems. So now that we know what primary law is, where does it live?
Well, this right here is federalism in action. We operate on a dual track, completely parallel system. You've got federal courts handling federal matters and state courts handling state matters. And the absolute most important word to remember here is parallel. The federal system isn't just sitting above the state system, bossing it around or micromanaging it. No, they are distinct, side-by-side tracks, and each one has its own supreme authority sitting right at the very top.
Which brings us to part three, federal versus state jurisdiction. How do you actually know which track you're supposed to be on? Let's look at the exact borders of these two parallel universes. It really comes down to general versus limited jurisdiction. State courts, they have general jurisdiction. They act like this massive umbrella covering the vast majority of our day-to-day lives. Family law, robberies, speeding tickets, you name it. Federal courts, though, are highly restricted to limited jurisdiction. They are literally only allowed to hear matters that are explicitly authorized by the Constitution or by federal statutes. We're talking very specific things like bankruptcy, patents, or maritime law. But, okay, there is one major exception that allows a state-level issue to cross over into federal court, and it hinges on this magic number, $75,000. If you've got a dispute between residents of completely different states, say a guy in Texas suing someone in Maine, and the amount in dispute is more than 75 grand, boom, that triggers diversity of citizenship. It basically acts like a passport, moving the whole case into the federal court system just to guarantee absolute neutrality for everyone involved. All right, part four, the court hierarchy. We've drawn the borders, so let's look at the actual internal ladders of power. Both systems actually share a perfectly mirrored three-tiered framework. Down at the base, cases start in trial courts, so district courts federally or superior courts at the state level. Actually, fun fact, New York uniquely calls its baseline trial court the Supreme Court, which is delightfully confusing for everyone. Anyway, if you lose at the baseline, you appeal up to the intermediate tier, like the federal circuit courts. Finally, at the very top, you have the state and U.S. Supreme Courts. And listen, this isn't just about prestige. It's a strict chain of command. The legal interpretations made at the top become the absolute law of the land that lower tiers are literally forced to apply. It guarantees the whole system stays consistent. Part 5. Binding versus persuasive authority. This is all about the rules of legal gravity. When does a judge actually have to follow a past ruling? First up is binding authority. This is mandatory law. A court absolutely must follow it. But the real trick to understanding the hierarchy is that a court is only bound by the courts directly above it, in its specific chain of command. So when the U.S. Supreme Court makes a ruling on a federal issue, that acts as a mandatory rule binding every lower court in the country. But same goes for the middle tier. An intermediate federal circuit court strictly binds all the district courts directly beneath it. The lower courts literally have no choice. They just have to obey. Now compare that with persuasive authority. This is law that a court might use, but they totally aren't obligated to follow it. So why would a judge even bother? Well, a lot of times courts face novel issues, stuff they've literally never seen before. In these cases of first impression, they can look around and borrow brilliant ideas from outside their own jurisdiction. For example, courts all over the country constantly look to Delaware for persuasive authority on corporate and business law, just because they have so much specialized expertise. Or neighboring states might look at each other for persuasive arguments on shared regional problems, like water rights out west. It's highly influential for sure, but at the end of the day, it's a suggestion, not a command. And finally, Part 6, Real-World Legal Scenarios. Let's actually put this map of the law to the test and see how it works in practice. Let's try a quick cross-jurisdiction riddle. Imagine a North Dakota court is facing a completely novel legal issue. But right next door, the Minnesota Supreme Court has already ruled on this exact same topic. Does North Dakota have to listen to Minnesota? Nope, not at all. That ruling is purely persuasive. Why? Because Minnesota lacks jurisdiction over North Dakota. Remember those parallel tracks we talked about? North Dakota and Minnesota are on totally separate parallel state tracks. Because they don't share jurisdiction, a ruling from a neighbor is just a really good suggestion. It holds absolutely zero binding gravity. Okay, let's try a slightly trickier one, focusing on state sovereignty. Suppose the California Supreme Court makes a decision that you absolutely must report any traffic accident to the California DMV, or you face a fine. It's a purely state-level mandate. Who exactly is bound by that precedent? So, obviously, all the lower California state courts are bound by their own state Supreme Court. But check out this twist. If a powerful federal court ends up addressing this specific state law issue, maybe because it crossed over via that $75,000 diversity rule we mentioned earlier, that federal court is actually bound by the California Supreme Court. Since state Supreme Courts are the ultimate deciders of their own state constitutions and laws, they outrank even the federal judiciary when interpreting purely state laws. And that right there perfectly illustrates our final takeaway today. When you're dealing with a purely state law issue, like a standard negligence claim, a state Supreme Court is the ultimate master. Even if they're incredibly prestigious U.S. Supreme Court rulings or Federal Circuit opinions on very similar federal laws, those prestigious federal opinions remain purely persuasive. The actual weight of authority is driven by strict jurisdictional boundaries, not just prestige. So look, the next time you catch a headline about some major court ruling, don't just look at what the judge decided. Pay attention to exactly which court made the decision and what type of law they were interpreting. Ask yourself, does this ruling actually hold the gravity to bind my local courts? Or is it just a really persuasive suggestion from a parallel universe? Having this deep dive and simple understanding of the hierarchy of the courts honestly changes exactly how you see the rules governing our world. Keep all of this in mind next time you're diving into the news. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.